Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our spring term. Wonderful to see so many faces when the temperature is so bleak outside. And as I said in the all-member email earlier this week, perhaps we would think about Mediterranean climates that cheer us all up. But I hope this evening will warm you up in many ways, and it's a great pleasure to welcome back someone who was such a huge success. Some of you with long memories may remember meeting Professor Jonathan Hopkin in January 2015. Can anyone remember back that far? Was that before Brexit? A lot has happened. So whatever he said then, he might have forgotten. We hope you've forgotten, because a lot of it has changed. And of course, Jonathan is going to talk about, as you know, from what you see on the slide and what you've seen in the emails, is going to talk about the Mediterranean part of Europe, with a particular focus on Italy, which, as you've seen from his CV, he knows extremely well. He's lived there, worked there. But he is also, in the Q&A, if there are European countries in that area that he hasn't mentioned and you want to ask questions about, he's very happy to take your questions about those too. So I'm not going to say further which countries he's going to talk about, because Jonathan Hopkin is about to reveal all. Welcome back.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. Thanks to all of you for turning out on a night like this. To be honest, I could see myself being at home watching Netflix. Or actually, the recent thing I've been watching is the Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which is extremely gripping. But instead, we're going to talk about the sunny Mediterranean, except that on my last trip to Italy, which was over New Year, I went to the Abruzzo region in southern Italy, where the temperature was actually not far away from what it is here now, because I was at 700 meters above sea level. And in a way, I suppose I don't know how familiar some of you, I'm sure, know some of the countries I'm going to talk about tonight quite well. But I think there are a lot of kind of assumptions and stereotypes and tropes about Southern Europe, some of which are actually not far away from the truth, some of which obscure some of the truth. And I think what I'm going to try and do, at the expense of maybe imagining that you know less than you maybe do, is tell a bit what I think is the truth about the way Southern Europe is. And in particular, I'm a professor of comparative politics at LSE, so I look at it from the point of view of thinking about politics, the economy, and society. And I think Southern Europe has many problems. It's very often, very commonly seen in Europe as being a place which isn't well governed, it's very inefficient, quite chaotic societies, and so on. And in part, that's not totally untrue, but at the same time, there are many dimensions of Southern Europe which are much more positive. And I want to try and bring those two things together and try and think about how the kind of messy politics of Southern Europe sit atop a society which is surprisingly resilient. And after all, I think probably most of you are very familiar with the idea that Southern Europe is not a bad place to live, despite all its problems. So I'm going to touch on some of that. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I have quite a bunch of slides. I have to warn you, some of them contain charts and graphs, but you don't really need to pick apart what they're telling you, because I will explain all. They're more props to me to remind me what I'm supposed to say. So we're going to talk about some of the kind of myths and stereotypes about Southern Europe and the realities of the economy and society. We're going to talk in particular about the sort of last decade and a half or so of European politics, which, as well as producing Brexit, which is not the topic of this evening's talk, but seems to be on our minds a lot still. but instead about something related to Brexit, which is the consequences of the global financial crisis of 2008 for the Eurozone and in particular Southern Europe. Then I'm going to talk about what I see as being the political fallout from that crisis, which on one level is not entirely over, but certainly the political consequences of it have become much more apparent since I was last here. So I was thinking back, I looked at my old slides, and in 2015 it wasn't yet quite so apparent how this crisis was going to change the politics of Southern Europe, and then I'll try and sort of reach beyond the case to look at some tentative lessons or insights that might be useful for the rest of us, because I think we have a lot to learn from Southern Europe as well as Southern Europe potentially having a lot to learn from us. It's very typical in Southern Europe for people to say, oh, you know, we're not a civilized country, it's a mess, nothing works. Of course, we say that here too, right? And in Britain, it's increasingly something we talk about. It's a minor miracle that my train actually arrived roughly on time in Stoke. But it's a very common thing for Southern Europeans to say about themselves, that their societies don't work. And they very often look up to countries in Northern Europe as a model to follow. And in some respects, that might be legitimate. But I think there are respects in which I think those of us in Northern Europe could learn from them. So here we go. Feel free to yell at me if I'm not being clear and if I'm moving too quickly. I have quite a few slides to get through. The nastier bits are at the beginning, so settle in. And this is probably the worst chart at all. I was warned not to produce charts like this, but the warning came too late. So a couple of things I want to say about Southern Europe is that actually, although I think, for a long time Southern Europe was seen as being a sort of poor, backward part of Europe, this is less and less true. So I'm sure many of you have traveled in Southern Europe, and you may or may not have been surprised at how economically and socially advanced much of it is. But if we look at these two charts, they're kind of different ways of measuring the level of economic development and the living standards enjoyed by people in Europe in a handy map form using data which I'm sure you're not interested in about these nuts 3 regions. Happy to talk about that if anyone cares, but what it allows us to do is see how levels of economic development vary across Europe. And I managed to find some pre-Brexit charts. One of the awkward things about Brexit is that we are no longer part of Eurostat, which means a lot of the comparative data and evidence we look at to compare Britain with the rest of Europe no longer exists, which is probably convenient for the people who decided Brexit was a good idea. So on the map on the left, the darker the shades of pink, the more economically developed the region is. So it's not surprising you'll see that there are areas around the southeast of England, around Paris and France, and much of the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland is outside, but it would be there too. Southern Germany, these are all areas that I think you're familiar with the idea that they're very economically advanced. But you will also see that northern Italy and northern Spain, and even the chunk of Greece around Athens, are also relatively high up in terms of economic development. So the north of Italy in particular is an economic powerhouse. And if I've heard Italian friends of me, I've heard describe northern Italy as a kind of dirty Switzerland. A kind of shabby Switzerland. Very, very rich, perhaps a bit more chaotic than Switzerland, most places are, but very, very economically developed. And if we look in the chart on the right, again, we get similar mapping, and we're looking at income levels, which are obviously very strongly associated with economic development. And again, the darker shades of green are the richest parts of Europe in terms of living standards. Then as you move towards the poorer end, you have the sort of light gold and then dark gold colors. So again, you can see that the core of Europe is the rich part. Britain is excluded from this chart for Brexit reasons, but most of Britain would be sort of in a similar place to northern Italy. So you can see the most economically developed and high-income parts of Europe tend to be around this kind of core area of Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, parts of France, but also northern Italy, and also parts of Spain. Northern Spain around the Basque Country and Madrid are also quite high-income areas, as is the area around Rome. So this is just to say that if you entertained any thoughts that Southern Europe has remained economically relatively less developed, that is only partially true. It's true that if we look at the southern tip of Italy and the southern part of Spain, they remain relatively a little bit poorer. But in many respects, income levels in Southern Europe are not really too different to what they are in Britain outside the southeast, which is where highest levels of prosperity are found, obviously enough. So are these countries laggards? Are they falling behind the rest of us? Well, not really. They've enjoyed really substantial economic growth. Oh, this chart's come out a bit differently to the way I saw it on my slides. But anyway, basic point there is if you can see that this is a chart measuring GDP per capita, which is in layman's terms, income per head of these countries. And you can see that the broad trend towards economic growth is really very similar between Germany, the UK, Italy, France, and Spain. Spain is catching up a little bit, getting closer to Italy. Germany is starting to take off a little bit. So you can see that actually this chart, which covers the period from the early 1990s until the global financial crisis, you can see that there is, broad economic progress across all of these countries, and Southern Europe isn't any different. If anything, it's kind of catching up and converging with the richer.
Could you read out the countries?
Yeah, so at the top you have Germany, then the UK, then Italy, then France, and then Spain. The biggest mover there is that Spain was much further behind the other countries at the beginning of the series in around 1992, and it's much closer when we get to the end. So one of the questions some people might ask is, why did Britain opt for Brexit, but other European countries who in many respects had a tougher time of it after the financial crisis than we did, why are they still in the EU? Well, that's because they associate being in the EU with economic progress. And there is every reason to believe that Spain in particular, joining the EU, or the EC as it was then in 1986, was a crucial part of its economic progress. So, these countries are richer than many people think, okay? They're not the richest parts of Europe, but they're certainly not the poorest, and pockets of these countries are actually very, very prosperous. So if you go to Madrid, or Barcelona, or the Basque Country, if you go to Milan, or any part of northern Italy, if you go to Rome, you would see living standards which are really pretty decent compared to most of the UK. So, what else can we say about Southern Europe that may sort of come as a surprise to some people, maybe not most of you? These are places where the standard of living may not be particularly outstanding in terms of actual money incomes, but in terms of the quality of life people enjoy and the health and well-being they enjoy, these are very good places to be living. So more or less every summer I spend a couple of weeks in Sardinia, which has beautiful coastline, obviously. But it is one of the poorer regions in Europe, and yet it has amongst the highest life expectancy of any part of the world. So this is actually something a friend of mine from Sardinia sent me. On the left there, you can see this lady who is celebrating her 108th birthday. She's called Tia Tata. She was born in 1916. Now, of course, there are people living to ripe old ages in lots of places, but it is unusually common in Sardinia and in some other parts of Italy for people to reach the age of 100. And that is despite the fact that these are not people who are wealthy. I'm not sure of the particular economic circumstances of Tia Tata, but I don't think she's a billionaire. She probably lived on an income that by our standards would seem quite low. And yet, the living standards that she enjoys, the quality of life she enjoys, has clearly helped her live to a very ripe old age. So yet another of these nasty map charts mapping life expectancy across different European countries. On that map there on the right, the darker the shades of blue, the longer women. I've taken women because the data is slightly different to men, but they usually present it differently. But usually in places where female life expectancy is very high, male life expectancy is also high. So in the dark-colored areas is where life expectancy is highest. Again, Britain's outside for Brexit reasons. So Northern Europe actually does pretty well, Scandinavia, where standards of living are very high, but the weather isn't so good. But you can see that Italy, Spain, and France, and even parts of southern Germany and parts of Greece are the countries where people live the longest. So they must be doing something right. And yes, they have a favorable climate, they grow lots of nice food, but it can't only be about the climate, because as you can see, Northern Europe also does quite well. So there's something about societal dynamics, the kinds of lives that people lead, which is clearly beneficial enough for them to live to a very old age. So another level of this, and another ugly chart, but again, be patient with me because the charts will be over quite soon. One thing that's quite interesting as well about Southern Europe is that we live in an age where the mental health crisis is something we're constantly confronting. As a university professor, I'm encountering the fact that universities are increasingly having to invest what little money they have increasingly heavily in services for student well-being. There is a mental health crisis in the country more broadly, but it's very visible in universities too. So a mental health kind of epidemic, if you like, is something that's becoming increasingly apparent to people working on the field of public health. And in terms of the kind of symptoms of poor mental health, generally speaking, there are some countries that do better than others, and Southern European countries are pretty well placed. Britain actually does okay as well. Whereas countries like the United States, Mexico, Sweden, Korea do really quite badly. So have a larger share of the population with poor mental health. One interesting thing to note is, I don't have a pointer here, but you can see if you go along around 2/3 of the way along, just next to the United States, you have Greece. The interesting point about Greece is that mental health has clearly declined quite considerably since the economic crisis of the late 2000s, early 2010s. And so Greece is much more poorly placed in terms of mental health comparatively than it was at the beginning of that period. And this can even translate into tragic outcomes such as suicide, which again vary a lot across countries. Very high levels in Korea, for example, very low levels in Turkey, Greece, and Mexico, followed by Italy, and a few more along we have Spain, and UK again does quite well. And then Portugal. So Southern Europe in general seems to be very highly placed in terms of some of these statistics. So actually, I don't want to bore you with charts all evening, but I think it's worth pointing out that the impression we often get, those of you who've traveled to Southern Europe, that people seem to be quite relaxed and happy, maybe isn't just an impression. Maybe there is, data to support the fact that on some level, the quality of life that people enjoy is in some ways higher than in some apparently much more prosperous societies. So, economic progress, whilst preserving, if you like, some of the, relaxed pace of life, perhaps, that we would associate with societies that have not undergone rapid economic change. So there's an extent to which I can see Southern Europe as having acquired some of the benefits of economic development without taking necessarily all of the disadvantages. And economic growth doesn't come without a cost. The way in which technological changes to the way we work, changes to the way we relate to each other in commerce. All of these things have social consequences which can, even things that make us richer don't necessarily make us happier. And I think Southern Europe has done pretty well in preserving some of the features of social and cultural life that makes people happier while they become richer. So that's the good news. How about thinking about something a little bit less cheerful, which is that over the last decade and a half, the world economy and the European economy quite specifically has gone through a period of extreme turbulence. We had the global financial crisis of around 2008, although it actually kicked off a little bit earlier than 2008 and carried on a little bit longer. But I think you will all remember those terrifying moments when the whole financial system seemed to be melting down. And within the Eurozone, this had really quite dramatic consequences, which has led to a period of impoverishment for many people in Southern Europe. So I'm just going to discuss the ways in which this crisis developed and posit some of the social and economic consequences which can explain why the politics of these countries has become so messy. So, what happened with the euro? Of course, Britain didn't join. If we had joined the euro, we probably wouldn't have Brexited because we'd have been stuck in this currency area. But the euro, of course, has been an advantage for Southern European countries because it allowed them to effectively hang themselves on the German anchor of low inflation and financial probity. But when it came to the financial crisis, this had quite devastating consequences. And it has torn the Eurozone apart. I would be nervous making these kind of arguments before the 2016 referendum, but now that's been and gone. I'm a Europhile. I definitely think that Britain made a mistake leaving the European Union, but I'm very critical of the way the Eurozone functions. And I think in many ways the euro has been a disaster for Southern Europe. Now, the euro crisis, which you will recall involved the effective bankruptcy of some Southern European governments, in particular Greece, was perceived in the richer, more creditworthy Northern European countries as being a kind of morality tale. So here we've got a couple of headlines, front pages for glossy political magazines, one in the Netherlands and one Der Spiegel in Germany, in which they articulate a view of the Eurozone crisis in which the hard-working Northern Europeans, the people in their overalls, fiddling around with machinery there on the top of the picture on the left, contrasted with the lazy, bon vivant Southern Europeans who simply sit and enjoy the sunshine whilst the hardworking Dutch and Germans create all the prosperity. And the headline, I'm assuming you know no Dutch, and I don't either, but I Google translated it. It says, no more money for Southern Europe. Because in order to get the Eurozone out of the debt crisis it was in around the beginning of the last decade, there were a series of financial bailouts. First of Greece, then again of Greece. There were 3 different memorandums of understanding involving financial assistance packages for Greece, but also Portugal and Ireland and indirect packages of financial assistance for Spain and also for Italy. So a lot of people in Northern Europe thought, well, these happy-go-lucky, lazy, irresponsible Southern Europeans are effectively living off our largesse. And this has created a lot of resentment, which we see resurfacing every time discussions about the management of the euro come up. And there's a lot of stereotyping here. So when you think of Italy, well, you think about what? Spaghetti. You think about kind of seductive language, ciao amore. Again, the headline here says, Italy is destroying itself and dragging us down with it. So certainly within the Eurozone, there's a lot of unhappiness, really, at how the creation of the euro has tied these Southern European countries to the northern ones, which maybe would have been quite prosperous on their own. So some of this has become, frankly, racist, and offensive. So in the early part of the 2010s, an acronym developed which described the countries, the debtor countries of the Eurozone, as the pigs. And it so happened that this could be derived from the first letters of the countries who required financial assistance. So the pigs were Portugal, Ireland, or Italy. Sometimes they put two I's in there. Ireland didn't quite fit, though, as a Northern European country. So usually the I refers to Italy. G, of course, is Greece, and S is Spain. So the idea here is that this is a cartoon of, and I think this one is from a British newspaper, in which you can see the euro is this sow being sucked dry, really, by these southern European countries plus Ireland, who desperately need financial support. There is another side of the argument that we see in some of the images around the Eurozone crisis, which is of Germany as being the sort of nasty, cleaver-wielding, stern disciplinarians who are making the lives of the poor little southern European pigs impossible. So you can see that the Eurozone crisis has created a whole set of kind of stereotypical ideas about the different roles that different countries play in the Eurozone. So who's right? Are the Southern Europeans too reliant on the largesse of the Northern Europeans? Or are the Northern Europeans cruelly imposing harsh austerity on the Southern Europeans? Well, my take on what actually happened is that it's quite a lot more complicated than that. That actually the crisis of the Eurozone was a crisis of financial markets. So rather than it actually being about Northern Europeans working hard, Southern Europeans working less hard, what actually happened was a set of speculative movements in financial markets which created the conditions for the Southern European countries to be bailed out. So what actually happened, and this chart very, very briefly describes the yields on government debt of different European countries when the euro was created and then when the euro crisis happened after the global financial crisis of 2008. So you can see before the euro came into existence, on the left-hand side of the chart there were dramatic differences in the amount of interest governments had to pay to get people to lend them money. So Greek government bonds were paying an interest rate much, much higher than countries like France or Germany. But after the euro was created, it was assumed that government debt had the same status for any Eurozone country. So the bond yields went down. And so for a period, Greece could borrow money in international markets at roughly the same cost that Germany could. Now, you may think that that might have been an unwise move for an investor to take, but financial institutions, major banks all across the world were assuming that this was the case until 2008, when all of a sudden people woke up and thought, well, hang on a minute, what if Greece defaults and exits the euro? What if they don't get bailed out? And suddenly everybody panicked. And so the bond yields diverged again. So actually, rather than some story about some groups of people being hardworking and others less so, what actually was going on was a massive failure of financial engineering. And the consequence of that was, you may think that we had a tough time with austerity in the UK, but in the Eurozone, it was much worse. So the time it has taken the Eurozone economy to recover from this debt crisis is much, much slower than even for the UK, never mind for the US. So the consequences of the euro debt crisis have stuck the whole Eurozone in a very dysfunctional level of economic growth, way below what it could have achieved in normal financial conditions. So as you can see, this is not really a story about saints and sinners, if you like, but instead a story of economic policy mistakes made at the European Union level. So the outcome of that is that actually, I showed you a chart charting GDP per capita, so average incomes in different countries in the period running up to the financial crisis. Here's another chart from the period after the financial crisis, and you can see that there is a divergence again. So whilst Germany, which is the blue line at the top there, has surged ahead, the other countries, the UK included, but also Italy, Spain, and especially Greece, have fallen behind. So in fact, Greece took until just before the COVID pandemic to return to the level of national output it had achieved just before the global financial crisis in 2008. So that is a wasted decade and a half. Things were not quite so bad in Italy and Spain, but they were certainly quite dysfunctional. So this has been a very, very long period of economic pain for Southern Europe, and you might not be surprised to know that that period of economic pain has come with some serious political consequences, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my talk. Okay, so messy politics. I think it's a familiar cliche that the politics of Southern Europe, and Italy especially, are messy. So Italy was once known for being a country where governments changed more or less every year. You would have a new prime minister every year. We in Britain used to scoff at the political instability of Italy. We're not scoffing quite so much anymore. But actually, interestingly, since the 1990s, politics had become quite a bit more stable in Italy, for reasons I don't have time to go into. But there'd been a period of relative political stability. Governments did not churn over quite so frequently. But in the aftermath of this debt crisis and this long period of recession and stagnation, then a whole series of political dynamics have been unleashed, which have severely tested the system. And the question I'm going to be asking, I'm going to describe some of the characters and some of the movements involved in this political crisis for Italy and Spain and Italy in turn. But then I'm going to hypothesize how we should interpret it, really. I'm going to ponder whether or not the radicalization of politics, the increasing polarization of politics in Southern Europe, is a sort of safety valve for a society under stress, or whether it is a little bit more than that, potentially a threat to democracy. So, in doing this, I'm drawing from a book I published in March 2020. I don't know if you remember March 2020. Yes, my book was supposed to hit the bookshops in March 2020. So you can still order it online, but I had a whole series of book talks and stuff planned, which ended up being on Zoom, which wasn't a lot of fun in my pajamas, talking about my book to a computer screen. But anyway, so what the book did is it described the fallout for this global financial crisis, not just in Southern Europe, but also in other countries too, particularly the UK and the US. And my argument is, and I think it's a fairly straightforward one, but it is controversial to some people, that actually the sort of upheavals we've seen in our politics over the last few years are the predictable result of the way in which the economy has created greater inequality, more uncertainty and insecurity in people's lives, and in particular, massive financial and economic losses for many people since the 2008 financial crisis. I think it's entirely unsurprising that our politics are upside down the way they are. It seems now a long time ago since Lehman Brothers collapsed, since there were queues forming outside Northern Rock bank branches here in the UK. It's more than a decade ago. It's getting on for 2 decades ago, right? But the consequences of that are still being felt, and they have infected, if you like, our politics and made everybody very angry. And when people get angry, they tend not to opt for the mainstream, safe, responsible politician. Instead, they opt for the rabble-rousers, right? And we've seen this happen in so many different places. I argue in the book that Brexit is one of these manifestations. Obviously, Donald Trump is another. But in Southern Europe, we have another set of actors, and it's a little bit more of a complicated one. I promise you I'll be done with the charts in a minute. This is my bread and butter. This is what I bore my students with every day. And so I sort of This is my default, I opt. Yeah. So anyway, here's the data. But what you need to know about this by looking at this chart, which plots the share of the vote in national elections being received by radical, what I call anti-system political parties in all Western European countries, averaged out over the period 1994 to 2018. And as you can see, it's constantly rising, and it particularly picks up after the global financial crisis of 2008. Why is this something worth saying? I think it's kind of obvious, but if you listen to a lot of people talking about Trump, about Brexit, about Le Pen in France, and so on, they will say, well, obviously it's because of things like immigration, it's because of things like the woke culture. There's a whole argument out there that it's actually cultural change which is unsettling people. It's not really about the economy at all. Now, some people may indeed be unsettled by cultural change, but if you remove economic growth from people's lives, that tends to make them a little bit madder than hearing some story about a transgender athlete or a few asylum seekers coming over on boats. So although it is true that these kind of arguments are very prominent in our politics, the underlying causes of the disruption, to my mind, are to be found in what's happened to the economy. Now, in the Eurozone, what you can see is that not only the number of voters opting for anti-system parties, for more radical, non-mainstream political parties has jumped up, but it follows a particular kind of pattern whereby the different countries in Northern and Southern Europe have different kinds of political reactions. So what this chart shows is that the anti-system vote in Northern and Southern European countries, what I call here surplus and deficit countries, follow different patterns. In Northern Europe, the greatest rise has been for radical right political parties, whereas in Southern Europe, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the biggest rise in support was of the radical left parties. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. The Southern European countries were the ones who had no money, who wanted the richer parts of Europe to redistribute to them, to help them out. So it's obvious that left-wing parties would be more likely to articulate that kind of discourse. The richer countries of Northern Europe were in the position of saying, hang on a minute, why should I share what I have with these people who've found themselves in financial difficulty? And that is a kind of more protective, if you like, idea that you're more likely to hear on the political right. So for that reason, the forms of radicalism in different countries have taken systematically different forms depending on the country's position in this Eurozone system. Okay, so I'm just going to, in the rest of the talk through these two cases and just give you a flavor of some of the political movements and political leaders that have emerged out of this rather chaotic period. So, first starting with Spain. So, Spain's a country a lot of British people visit quite often. It's a fantastic country. For family reasons, I spend more time in Italy, but it's not because I think Italy is better. I love Spain. I think it's a fantastic place. It seems a very laid-back place. Wherever I go, people seem quite nice and happy and not too tense or stressed out. I live in London, by the way, so, you know, I do need a break from people shoving me out of the way on the way to the tube station every now and again, and Spain is a perfect place for that. But if you listen to politicians talking in Spain, you would think the country was on the brink of civil war. Now, I always have this kind of doubt. Should I listen to the politicians? Are they reflecting the real way people are? Or should I look at people on the street who seem a little bit less fussed by things? There's no doubt that when politicians sound angry, they think that's going to work for them politically. They think that voters are angry enough to want to listen to that kind of story. So clearly there is some anger and resentment in there. So who benefited from the economic crisis in Spain? Which new political actors came along and articulated this anger at the economic situation? So one of the first, as Spain, like many of the Southern European countries, initially turned to the left, the mainstream Socialist Party was like Labour and under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in Britain, suddenly wasn't left-wing enough. In a situation of crisis, you need strong measures. So Britain went for Jeremy Corbyn. Well, the Labour Party membership did. And in Spain, a lot of voters on the left deserted the Socialist Party, who they thought were not helpful in the financial crisis, and a completely new political party called Podemos, under this guy, Pablo Iglesias, emerged. Some of you might know that in Spanish, Podemos means we can. That might sound familiar, right? So there's a kind of Obama-esque feel to what Iglesias was doing, but he was rooted very firmly on the political left. So the first shock is that this guy, and by the way, you probably know this anyway, but one of the first things I learned in political science was when people vote in elections in established democracies, they tend to vote for the same parties over and over again. Things don't change all that much, right? Even in Britain, despite the chaos we're in, it's still a fight between Labour and the Conservatives most of the time, right? This was also true in Spain, but Podemos was a completely new party. It never stood in an election before, and it immediately got around 15% of the vote, much in the same way UKIP prospered in the UK. So you had this left anti-austerity party emerging. But then something else kicked off, which is that in Catalonia, in the northeastern corner of Spain, the region which Barcelona is the capital of, which has a long tradition of feeling different from the rest of Spain. It's got its own language, its own literature, and before the unification of Spain in the 17th century, it had its own kingdom, the Kingdom of Aragon. So there's been a long-standing demand from people in Catalan society for more independence from Spain. But after the financial crisis, this got turbocharged. And so in around 2012, there was an upsurge in support for Catalan independence. Much in the same way as in Scotland, around the same time, there was a referendum for independence there too, in which the yes vote received many more votes than most people expected. So this banner reflects a typical demand of the Catalan nationalists. Spain is stealing from us, it says. They're stealing 6,000 million euros a year off us, which is all about tax. So Catalans claim that they contribute more tax to the Spanish revenue than they receive back in government spending. It's a familiar complaint for relatively prosperous regions in lots of countries. But this went a little bit further than just asking for their money back. The Catalan nationalist politicians who ran the regional government set up a referendum on independence. Small problem. It was illegal under the Spanish constitution to hold a referendum for independence in Catalonia, because the Spanish constitution clearly says that Spain is a unified state and that there is no prospect of that being broken. But they held a referendum anyway. It was an illegal referendum. There were trouble with the police. There were a lot of political tensions around this vote, but the vote took place. Most of the people who voted for independence. Most Catalans who didn't want independence didn't vote, so the vote was clearly not really valid. But in any case, the Catalan government made a unilateral declaration of independence, which is there on the right. So what happened next? They announced to cheering crowds of Catalan nationalists, we are declaring independence from Spain. That's the image on the left. Woman cheering in the Parc de la Ciutadella in Barcelona. I don't know if you've ever been there. This is where this announcement was made. Then the Catalan president said, but we are suspending the Declaration of Independence so we can open negotiations with Spain. That's the picture on the right. Some people said that the Catalan Declaration of Independence lasted for 6 seconds. Now, this is kind of funny, but not so much, because as a result of that, several Catalan politicians involved in organizing the referendum were sent to jail or escaped to exile to avoid prosecution. So Carles Puigdemont, the leader of the Catalan government at that time, has been in Belgium for the last 5 years as a result of the attempts by Spanish authorities to try them for the crime of sedition, which is a term that you may remember from 19th century British history. Not only were there judicial consequences, but those people in the rest of Spain who had no sympathy for Catalan nationalists, some of them got very angry indeed. And this led to a resurgence of a very kind of angry, quite reactionary Spanish nationalism on the right. So this banner is from some protesters protesting against Catalan nationalists. And the banner says, "Spain cannot be sold, it must be defended." So this idea that Spain was at risk, that the unity of the nation was important and should be defended. And given Spain's history, this very easily can be associated with the experience of the Franco dictatorship, which only finished in 1976. And there is still a slice of Spanish society who doesn't think Franco was such a bad guy after all. And on the back of that, you've seen the rise of a new right-wing party in Spain. So again, new parties never really do that well in Western democracies, or at least they didn't used to until the last decade or so. And now we're seeing new parties crop up in lots of places. And this new party on the right in Spain is called Vox. Vox is the Latin for voice. It would be voz in Spanish. And it is led by this guy, Santiago Abascal. And some of the rhetoric this party uses is extremely resentful and even violent. And they're very, very hostile to Catalan nationalism. They are very, very hostile to the left, to people like Pablo Iglesias, and even to the current Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez. And Pedro Sánchez, in order to stay in power, because there were elections in Spain last year, no party won an overall majority, and in order to remain in power, Sánchez, who was a socialist, made a deal with the Catalans. So this guy here is Puigdemont, the guy who made the Declaration of Independence, who has been living in Waterloo in Belgium since 2017 to avoid arrest. They made a deal in which Puigdemont will support the Sánchez government as long as Sánchez gives him an amnesty from any prosecution for sedition. So this has been very controversial, and this is right-wing Spaniards outside the Socialist Party headquarters in Madrid with an effigy of Pedro Sánchez hanging from a noose. Given Spain's history, this is not the kind of thing you take lightly. Spain has come a long way since the Franco dictatorship, but people still remember the things that happened during the Franco dictatorship, and people still evoke the memory of the Civil War in the 1930s. So when people start making these kind of statements that Sánchez is a traitor, it suggests a political system that is not at ease with itself. So, Spain, lovely place, nice people, nasty-sounding politics. I often feel that Spanish politics over-polarizes the society. And I think we can see that happening in many countries at the moment. The US, I think, falls into that category. But when politicians prosper out of using polarizing and violent language, that suggests that voters have at least some sympathy with that idea. You know, if people were at ease with each other, then the excesses of sort of right-wing rhetoric probably wouldn't be so successful. So what's been going on in Italy, just to finish the story? Now, in Italy, actually, they did all of the populism stuff years ago. So you need a longish memory to remember this guy coming along. So this was when I was a graduate student in Florence doing my PhD. I just kind of got used to this, oh yeah, in Italy the government changes every year, it's quite corrupt. Yeah, I've just kind of got my head around that system. And then the whole system collapsed under the weight of prosecutions for corruption of basically the entire government in 1990 to 1993. So along comes Silvio Berlusconi. He was basically the Italian Donald Trump before his time. So he was a media magnate, so he had interest in television. He was very good on television. He also owned a football team. He had several wives and was well known for his flirting and so on, all very Trumpian. He also had a long history of run-ins with the judicial authorities, just like Trump. So very, very similar kind of character. So he decides the entire political system has collapsed. I'm going to run the government. Right? So it's a bit like Rupert Murdoch deciding to stand for election. I don't know if that would have worked, probably not. But in Italy, there was a vacuum of power. And Berlusconi owned the 3 main private television channels. That tends to be a bit of an advantage when you're running a political campaign. So he set up a new party called Forza Italia, which means "Come on Italy," like you would shout at a football match. And his slogan was "For a new Italian miracle." He said he would return Italy's faltering economy to the boom years of the 50s and 60s. And surprisingly, he was no flash in the pan. He remained at the core of Italian politics until really a few years ago. He died last year, but he was still in parliament. So this guy has actually loomed large over Italian politics for a very long time. And he managed to sort of project himself as not being an ordinary politician. He was actually a worker, an operaio, a man who rolled his sleeves up and went to work and got things done. And he was president of the government for several years in that period. When did Berlusconi's political career run into the rocks? Well, precisely on the back of the euro crisis of the early 2010s. So Berlusconi was in office when the financial crisis happened. Italy obviously was under a lot of pressure, and the authorities in the European Central Bank and in the German government were very keen for Italy to avoid a financial bailout, and that meant having to introduce a series of quite painful reforms, cutting budgets, raising taxes, changing some economic regulations, things that would make any government unpopular. Berlusconi dug his heels in and didn't want to do that, at which point the European authorities called the Riot Act, and the 2 central bankers we see in the picture conspired to effectively force Berlusconi out of power. The guy on the right, Jean-Claude Trichet, who was the 2nd president of the European Central Bank, and the man on the left, Mario Draghi, an Italian who was later prime minister, who was his successor as the European Central Bank governor, wrote a letter to Berlusconi saying, either you do this, this, and this, or we're going to have to pull all financial support away from Italy so that your country will go bankrupt. And at that point, Berlusconi had to resign. So this was an example, really, of how being in the Eurozone was a severe constraint on the freedom of national governments, especially debtor governments in Southern Europe, to do the kind of things they wanted to do. And as a result of that, it became very, very clear that membership of the Eurozone for Italy meant that they were always under surveillance and would not be free to follow the policies they wanted. So Berlusconi suddenly found himself shuffled off the stage, and he was succeeded by another populist, this time a chap called Beppe Grillo. Now, Beppe Grillo was, and probably still is, a comedian, like a literal comedian. It's like having Ken Dodd standing for political office. So Beppe Grillo, he decided he would launch a political movement. This political movement wasn't of the left or of the right. It was a movement based on his hatred of politicians, which is actually a political program most people can coalesce around, as it happens, especially in Italy. So this was one of his big slogans, Basta partiti, which means we've had enough of parties. So political parties were the problem. Let's do democracy without political parties. How are we going to do that? The internet was his answer. So he had a kind of far-fetched scheme whereby instead of people voting in elections for politicians who would sit in parliament and make decisions for us, instead you'd be able to have electronic voting on all the most important matters of the day, and that's how government would work. Now in Q&A maybe we can talk about why that obviously wouldn't work, but it was popular enough to gather a lot of support. So again, like Podemos, a brand new party, never stood in elections before, in the 2014 elections, won 34% of the vote in Italy. Quite extraordinary, the kind of thing that even in Italy was unprecedented, right? Why was this important? Well, it was important because the Grillo program included a referendum on leaving the euro. So obviously that got people very twitchy in Frankfurt and Berlin and Paris because, having a vote on leaving the euro could potentially unleash financial chaos. Now, Grillo was not the only populist around at the time. We have another strand in Italy which is related to a kind of northern secessionism or separatism associated with this guy, Umberto Bossi, who died recently, but he emerged in the 1990s as the leader of a political movement called the Northern League. The Northern League stood for the independence of northern Italy from the rest of the country. The idea being that the south of Italy was a drain on the north, in much the same way as the Germans and the Dutch might see the Italians, the northern Italians saw the southern Italians in the same way. So his idea was that there would be a new independent state called Padania, after the name of the Po Valley, the Po River, which goes through the plains of northern Italy. So that was the idea. He's going to create a new state. So just like in Catalonia, you would create a new independent state, and the people in the south, well, they can look after themselves. Now, this party achieved a lot of influence, participated in several governments with Berlusconi. Eventually, Bossi became unwell, and his place was taken by a younger politician called Matteo Salvini. Matteo Salvini decided that why would you constrain yourself just to one part of Italy? Why don't you try and get votes elsewhere? So he turned the League into a national-level political party. It got rid of the northern part, didn't talk about making Padania independent anymore, but did talk an awful lot about immigration. So this became the key theme of the League. And he used this rather disquieting metaphor of the digger, as you can see on his T-shirt, the idea that you could somehow sweep away all of the people in society that right-minded citizens do not want to have around, and the implicit argument was essentially that he was talking about immigrants. Another T-shirt was "Stop the Invasion," again, very, very lurid, anti-immigrant kind of message. So you can see the politics lurching ever more to the right here. And after the experiment of the League being in government, we had another election, and this time an even more right-wing party, the Brothers of Italy party, led by Giorgia Meloni, who is now the current prime minister, came out as the strongest party. And again, the message is sort of quite inchoate. There's not a lot of policy detail. There's a lot of very strong rhetoric about nationality, symbols of identity. And she's well known for this speech she gave, in which she very angrily said, "I'm called Georgia, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am Italian." Now, it may now not sound so powerful a phrase if it's said by me in English at the end of a talk on a cold evening in Stoke, but in Italian, in front of a group of right-wing Spanish militants, it was very powerful. So the idea was that something, left-wing people and immigrants usually, are questioning her right to be a woman, to be a mother, to be Italian. So again, it's sort of articulating this sort of insufferance with the modern world that in an era where people are so angry is quite a successful type of campaign. And ultimately, these two have joined together in a government. This is Salvini and Meloni, and don't they look a happy couple? But the downside of it is young, appealing-looking people are building on a tradition of fascism. So this happened a couple of weeks ago. There was a commemoration of an incident in the 1970s when some right-wing activists, some members of genuine fascist movements, there was a lot of violence in Italy in the 70s and 80s around politics. So a group of fascists were killed by some left-wing activists, and there's a commemoration of their deaths. It happens every year, and this year this is what happened. Some, fascist salutes out in the open air, suggesting that there is part of Italian society that, again, is longing for the era of Mussolini. So, what does this tell us? What does this little tour of Southern European pathologies tell us? What are the lessons for the rest of us? I mean, when it comes to the politics, I don't think we can claim that we're entirely immune from this angry, resentful kind of politics too. We can see plenty of examples of that. But I think what we conclude, I've got 3 main points, and as I'm wrapping up, is that, first of all, imposing harsh economic austerity on a society has significant political costs. I think that's fairly obvious. At the time, many people were saying so. Politicians went ahead and did it, and the consequences are very deep and lasting. So, it's created a lot of upheaval, a lot of resentment, people resenting having to be bailed out, other people resenting bailing out. And this has led to people turning to new political forces who very often articulate quite extreme visions and makes peaceful coexistence that bit harder. So although the European Union has kind of given up on austerity and the Eurozone has had a new lease of life through these post-COVID investment measures and what's called the recovery plan, the damage to the political culture remains. What else can we say? Well, and I don't think this is unique to Southern Europe, that fascism and extreme right-wing political ideologies did not die after the Second World War. They just became dormant. And we can now see in a new, more angry world that the experience of fascism and authoritarianism is still relevant, not only in Southern Europe, but also in other parts of the world, particularly, most worryingly, in the United States. And you can see in Italy and Spain the sort of anti-fascist consensus of the mainstream politicians starting to crumble. And this raised the question, how capable are pro-democracy forces in our societies able to resist a more determined effort to overturn democratic institutions? I think the United States, sadly, is going to be the big test of that over the next few years. And then finally, I placed a lot of emphasis on the role of the economy in shaping politics and the way in which austerity and economic crisis leads to a very turbulent form of politics. But in the end, I still hold out the hope that the politics is somehow exaggerating the reality on the ground. And that people in Southern Europe actually have found a reasonable balance between a dynamic economy and a cohesive society, which has allowed people to preserve a way of life which, on the whole, seems to be pretty good for people. So, despite all of the pressures of the modern world, Italians still cook fresh food and eat properly, and they eat together as families or with friends. The culture of sitting in front of the computer with a sandwich from Pret does not exist or is very marginal. And these are the kind of things that actually make for a good society. So even if the economy is stagnant and politics is a mess, society can sometimes just keep going. And when you have something worth preserving, that's something we have to take seriously. And the final point is that in a world where economic growth may become harder and harder to justify, because economic growth very often comes with increasing costs in terms of the climate, that maybe the sort of slower pace of society in much of Southern Europe offers us a lesson as to how we might live a less carbon-intensive lifestyle. And Southern Europe is certainly going to have to do that because they are on the front lines of climate change. So, I probably talked too long, but I'm going to stop there and look forward to hearing your questions after the break.
Thank you, everyone, for getting back quickly. And there's lots of questions. I haven't had much time to analyze them, but I'll do my best for you. We've got Harry and Zena. They will have microphones, so put up your hand. I'm conscious that the weather outside is not Mediterranean. Well, it is in 700 meters. So we probably shouldn't go on beyond about 9:20. We'll do our best. So will Jonathan. One of the questions that Jill was saying, thank you for the charts. And just to remind you that, Jonathan has approved that tonight's proceedings should be on the website. And you can look at those charts, and with other presentations that have been made here, those charts come out perfectly well on your monitor, even if you're in the rear half of the theatre here, and it's a struggle to read them. So I do recommend that you visit the website and see when that's going to be available, because I thought they underpinned much of what Jonathan had to say tonight. In fact, Jill, who congratulated him on the charts, and wonders, as do some others, what lessons can we learn from Italy and Spain about managing the refugee situation? And someone else.
That's.
Can we just, if you wouldn't mind holding on, we've got a little bit of noise. Someone's not on silent. Is it outside that?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Sorry about that. It's not a phone. It's some students, right.
Well, that's given me a bit of thinking time. And the difficulty is that refugees arriving in Italy or Spain, generally speaking, don't want to stay there. And that's because the economic opportunities are fewer than in countries like the UK or France or Germany, where there is a more vibrant labor market. So for all I was saying that Southern Europe is very economically developed, but the labor market is terrible. So one of the long-standing scourges of the Southern European economy is high levels, persistently high levels of unemployment, which particularly affect younger people. So very, very high youth and unemployment rates. And so this is not an appetizing place for migrants to go to if they want to get, as most migrants do, build a material existence in the host country. So they move on. They try to get to other parts of Europe. Actually, my advice for Britain would be different than for Southern Europe. My advice for Southern Europe is try to get them to stay. Southern Europe has a very serious demographic imbalance. All societies in Western Europe are aging societies, but Southern Europe are aging more than most, for the very happy reason that they live longer on the whole, but also for the less happy reason that people have fewer children. And part of the reason people have fewer children is because of this high rate of unemployment that makes it harder for people to build, an economically stable family unit to bring up kids in. So my attitude to migration is that on the whole, it's like the weather. We can't really change it. If there's such demand from so many people and so many routes for people to make it to Europe, I think it's better we come to terms with the fact that people want to come here and that we also need them. I'm not suggesting that it's politically easy or smooth to make that happen. It's very obvious that the clash of cultures and the difficulties of absorbing a lot of people when the economy is not doing well anyway and people feel under pressure is a challenge. But I think that Southern Europe especially needs to come to terms with the fact that migrants are a way of saving some parts of Southern Europe which are effectively depopulating and dying because of lack of people.
Just adding on to that, in Brown, he wonders whether it's not just the migrants, but the over-reliance or the high reliance of Southern Europe on transient tourists. That didn't appear in your discussion. Is that a factor?
Okay, so tourism is an increasingly important industry globally. It's quite important in the UK as well. Clearly Southern Europe has an important tourist economy, and it's the one that we see. Those of us in Britain who go there very often tend to see the touristy places, so it looms very large. And France actually has more tourist footprint than Italy, Spain, or Greece do, but it's clearly an important part of the economy. But what I would say is that the part that people are less aware of here usually is all of the sort of manufacturing industry and a variety of types of service economic activity, which is not related to tourism. And in some cases, actually, Italy is a very fascinating case because Italy, just to tell a little anecdote, in Italy, when you go to the beach, some of you might have observed this, you usually don't arrive with a towel and an umbrella and park yourself on the beach. In a lot of beaches in Italy, there are already sunbeds out there, and it's all organized very carefully by a sort of resort manager. And the European Union is putting Italy under a lot of pressure to open up the management of these pieces of beach to open tender to competition. Italians are resisting this like crazy. And part of the reason is they see what would happen is if private equity companies started investing in these resorts, they would kick out most of the locals who attend the beaches and raise the prices to try and get higher value tourists in. And I think it's a good example of how actually, even though tourism is important strategically for the economy, it's also part of the way of life, and it has to be accommodating the needs of the local people to enjoy the sea and the sunshine and the countryside on a par with the tourists.
Sue Conway, picked up on what you said about Sardinia. I don't think she's going to move there, but she's obviously quite attracted by the idea of people who living in rather modest relative poverty, I think as you put it, but they're so long-lived. And she wonders, is it by any chance because within their society there's greater equality? Do you think that's a factor, or is it something to do with the oily fish that they eat?
Yeah. Actually, in Sardinia, Sardinia is a bit weird being an island. It's not a big fishing economy. Traditionally, Sardinians were afraid of the Turks, and they lived inland, and they mainly ate sheep and goats. So the diet isn't particularly Mediterranean, in fact. I mean, I wouldn't call it equality. I mean, I'm a social liberal, like most people working in universities. I'm not a traditionalist when it comes to social and cultural values. But I can see how a traditional society can be very frustrating and limiting for people, but at the same time is a great resource for people. So the strength of the family structure, the strength of the community structure, the fact that nobody ends up alone in these societies. You're living in a close-knit village, your neighbors probably drive you crazy, but unless you murder them, you'll put up with them. I mean, it sounds a flippant point, but a lot of serious violence in Italy is not towards strangers, but towards people you know, towards family members in particular, because the family structure is so powerful, it's something that you can't escape from in Italy, and if you don't like your family, it's a pretty bad situation to be in. But for most people, it's part of what makes for a good life, and I think this is probably, it's not so much equality, but there's a hierarchy in there. You respect the local priest, you respect the local mayor, but at the same time, it's not a society like you would see maybe in extreme cases, like in the United States, where you have incredibly rich people and dirt poor people. It is I would call it a more integrated society rather than a more equal one.
I'm going to combine two different questions, if you don't mind, just to see if there's a thread you can find. Sean King, the austerity following the 2008 crash may explain extremism in southern European politics, but why turn right instead of left? His question. Andrew Creswell, Italy has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. What effect do you think that will have on the politics in the years to come? Yeah,
great questions. I mean, on austerity, so I remember naively thinking in 2008, well, that's put paid to neoliberalism, and everybody is going to vote for social democratic parties who will bring back the kind of mixed economy of the post-war years in which the economy grew and everybody shared in the prosperity. Well, so much for that, right? That didn't happen. And it's interesting, the relative failure, I would have to say, of left-wing political options in the kind of austerity period. Why did they fail? Well, in part because it's a very hostile environment for a left-wing government to come to power, right? So the best example I could think of, and given that I didn't talk about Greece in the talk, is 2015, after a series of bracing austerity measures imposed as a consequence of the financial assistance packages to Greece. In 2015, the Greek electorate finally thought, enough is enough, we're going to vote for a completely new slate of politicians, this party called Syriza, which is a party of the left, but the non-traditional left, a bit more radical, and certainly they were expressing hostility towards the way the euro had been managed and the impositions on Greece coming from the ECB and from the European Commission and the Troika and so on. And when Syriza won power, the Eurozone authorities came along and says, okay, here's your financial assistance package, here is the austerity measures, tax rises, spending cuts, regulatory changes we're going to make you do. And Syriza said, I think we're going to ask the Greek public what they think about that. And they held a referendum. The referendum rejected the package. They then turned around and the Europeans said, okay, here's a new package, which is even worse than the last one. And Syriza accepted it. And they accepted it because the alternative was exiting the euro. It was a game of chicken, right? And Syriza blinked. The Germans and the European Commission and the ECB didn't believe that Greece would take the risk of leaving the euro, and they were right. So that's the left-wing option. You're railing against an international economic system which is not designed to make it easy for you to do those kind of things. So that would be the quickest answer, I guess. On the birth rate, I am the proud father of a half-Italian daughter, and I guess I'm part of the problem, because we only produce one child, which is very typical of Italian families. So what consequence does it have? In the short run, probably even in the medium run, what it means is that an increasingly large share of the electorate are people my age and above, who have very different interests to young people, many of whom are facing wages that are lower than they would have been 20 years ago. There's been a catastrophic decline in the quality of employment for young people in Italy in particular, but also in Spain to some degree, since the 2000s. So what that ends up meaning, though, is that they may vote for Podemos or for the Catalan separatists, but what they actually largely end up doing is not voting at all. So what you end up with is a very top-heavy electorate that is mainly concerned with maintaining the pension system as it stands, with trying to protect the health system. All of these are very important things. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a minute that pensions should be cut or health spending should be cut, because we've tried that in this country, and we see it ends up creating more problems than it solves. But it does mean that you end up with a very static society, because I can see as I hurtle towards my 60s how I'm very reluctant to change compared to the way I used to be, right? I think it's a natural thing. At an individual level, as we get older, we get more wary of change. When that happens to a whole society, then that becomes a problem. But it particularly becomes a problem if you have to embrace change. And if I come back to the answer I gave before on migration, I think, Italy and Spain, I live in London, right? So I go to Italy and Spain, and I think, why are people worried about immigration? There isn't any immigration. The proportion of society which is immigrants is tiny. Yet people are getting very upset about it, precisely because they're not used to migration. But these are countries that need people, right? They're not producing their own. It is a perfect trade. So as I said before, there are obviously a whole series of potential problems and challenges of integration, but in the end, it's supply and demand. Migrants want to come to Europe, and Europe needs people. And in the end, the quicker we all come to terms with it, the better.
I've got two questions coming up. The first one is from two people, Ian and Joe. And so they're wondering, Ian, to what extent do you think that the populist leaders are narcissists? Is their motivation self-aggrandizement? His way of putting it. And then he says, why are the voters taken in? Which is Joe Sexton's question, how are people taken in so easily by angry politicians with simple solutions? So there's a question from the land of Nigel Farage.
Right. Okay, on narcissism, I think to be a politician of any stripe, you need to be a bit of a narcissist. Somebody once described politics to me as show business for ugly people. And, I think that kind of works. So yes, are they more narcissistic than, is Nigel Farage more narcissistic than Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher? I'm not really sure in terms of character there's that much to choose between them. Clearly, though, the instruments they use, the appeals they make are very, very different. Why are people taken in? I've spent the last 10 years of my life trying to figure out, why could somebody not see Donald Trump as a crazed, self-centered maniac? It seems blindingly obvious to me, and yet there are millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Americans who believe he's their savior. The reluctant conclusion I have to draw, and I say reluctant because I came into academia because I wanted, it sounds a bit pathetic and worthy, but I wanted to help make the world a better place by understanding what was going wrong and trying to explain to people what was going wrong and how to deal with it. And I realized, 30 years into my academic career, that actually people don't want to listen to some professor telling them why things are going wrong. They want some red meat, right? It's like, I'm a Hull City supporter, and I watch the games, and we've had some bad refereeing decisions against us in recent times. But to be honest, the team is just not working as a team. It's not the referee's fault. But if you catch me on the 94th minute, when they conceded that last-minute goal against Birmingham on Tuesday night, I'm not ready to hear that, right? And I think in politics it's the same. You want to hear people have very emotional reactions to politics. And academics tend to try and rationalize everything as if everybody else was like us. But of course, that's just mad.
Our sympathies with regard to your football team and its result, but can we move on
it's an eternal
to a question I think is a good one. Do you think proportional representation facilitates extreme new political parties? And could this be one of the few advantages of our British first-past-the-post system of elections?
Right. Remind me who's in government at the moment, and how many prime ministers we've had, and whether we're talking about shipping people to Rwanda, even though it's illegal, and the planes wouldn't get insurance. I mean, I think. So I'm a big fan of proportional representation, so I would say that. The reason I am is slightly different, so I'll explain in a moment. But in terms of extremism, I think what we've seen, it's true that under PR, extremist parties are more likely to get a hearing, because extremist parties traditionally have usually been quite small, and small parties get represented better under PR, and in our system, small parties get wiped out. So UKIP never won a seat. They got a seat transferred from the Conservative Party, Douglas Carswell. They never actually won a seat on their own. The Greens have only ever won one seat, right, in Brighton. So, yeah, you could say, well, those, if you want to call the Greens extremists, they've never been given representation, so the system has worked. But actually, UKIP has effectively captured the Conservative Party. I mean, let's face it. When the Brexit referendum ran, 2/3 of Tory MPs supported Remain. Now, there isn't a Tory MP left who would say out loud that they think Brexit is a bad idea. Now, PR absorbs the extremes. What the first past the post does is, it pushes them out of the way until the momentum they have is so great that they overwhelm the whole system. And you can see this in the United States. Donald Trump is, to my mind, the most dangerous extremist politician to have been elected to any office in a Western democracy. And he's probably going to get elected again. And that's in the first past the post. So it just doesn't work that way. It used to, but it used to because our societies were not as polarized and angry as they are now. But I would just say one more thing about PR, and that's as somebody on the kind of center-left who believes in a bigger welfare state and a government that works more to increase equality in society, PR is good for that. So PR historically tends to give greater representation to parties advocating greater equality than first past the post does. And there are a kind of bunch of theoretical reasons I could bore you with, but I'm getting the feeling that just past 9 o'clock on a cold night. I'll save that for an email conversation if anyone wants to have it.
Just before I met you in the hotel, there was the big monitor showing the news, and Rishi Sunak was speaking, and there was a big caption on the bottom left, and it said Rwanda Bill. Yeah. And I thought that for one instant that he might have me on the list for the first flight. But I suppose there are quite a few other bills who watch the news who would have the same concerns. Now, could we just move on very quickly? If you want to use the microphone, put up your hand and let Zena and Harry see. We'll try to fit one or two in. But I just want to now roam over a few other parts of southern Europe, if you wouldn't mind sort of briefly commenting. I think you've dealt with Greece, but Pat Woodward is interested. Thanks for your interesting talk. What's the situation in Portugal? Harry and Zena, our students, have said Portugal's anti-system party, Chega, has only emerged quite recently. Why is this? And could they have similar success levels to parties in Spain and Italy? So let's deal with Portugal first, and then we'll move on to one or two others.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm less of an expert in Portugal, I've got to admit, so I focus mainly on Italy and Spain. Greece came to my consciousness a lot in the Euro crisis, Portugal a bit less. I mean, Portugal in many ways is quite similar to Spain. It has a very similar electoral system. It democratized it around the same time, so it became a democracy in the 1970s, just like Spain did. And the party systems even look quite similar. So the sort of pattern of party politics for a very long time looked very similar to Spain, with the exception that Portugal doesn't have any region that wants to secede, right? There Portugal is a fairly unified society culturally. For a long time, people were saying, why is there no right-wing extremism in the Iberian Peninsula? And then Vox came along, which only really emerged in the last 5 years or so, and now Chega has come along, which occupies a very similar kind of position. And so there is no Iberian exceptionalism. The only country left in Europe, as far as I can see, that doesn't have a far-right party is Ireland. But you can see from the events in Dublin a few weeks ago that there's precisely the same kind of fertile terrain for far-right politics there. So, you have a combination of economic stagnation and difficulties in governments being able to actually act on the things that concern people, and then finally this shock of migration, which, especially in a relatively homogeneous society like Portugal, even though it has had, of course, an empire until recently and had colonial walls and all the rest of it, is still a bit of a shock to the system. And Chega is, like in just about every other country in Europe, latching on to that sentiment. It seems to be a bit less successful than Vox. But I would just say there is also a left radical force very similar to Podemos, which reached government in the mid-2010s, which is called the Bloco de Esquerda, which means the left bloc, which, very similar to Podemos, was protesting against austerity and were, governing with the socialists until quite recently.
May not fit the model, but John Mottram wonders about Malta. I know it's a tiny country, but he wonders if you could say just a few words about political corruption and its financial situation. Yeah. And he says in brackets, Bet365, which we said is the biggest employer in Stoke, has difficulties there. We haven't got time to find out what they are.
What difficulties?
I have no idea, but we'll ask John Mottram afterwards.
Oh,
but
right.
Let's just sort of... Is that within your purview, Malta?
Well, not really. I don't know much about these places, never been. But what I know is that Malta and Cyprus are interesting in that they're effectively tax havens and conduits for money laundering on quite a major scale, as far as I understand it. And in Malta, there was this famous assassination of... I've forgotten her name, Caruana, I think she was called, was a journalist who was investigating some of these operations, and she was murdered as a result of that. And I think Cyprus has a huge amount of Russian money flowing, and increasingly a lot of Israeli money, panicking at the prospects of an increasingly unsafe environment they're in. So these seem to be places, and they're also heavily involved, like Portugal as it happens, in the business of selling European citizenship to rich people for cash. So you make an investment. Portugal have had this for a while. You make an investment. If it's big enough, they will give you a passport. And then you become a EU citizen with all of the rights to freedom of movement that we don't have anymore. And that's about all I know about those two countries. But I think potentially this is of systemic importance to the rest of Europe. Yeah.
Jeff Tucker's got your message about language and rhetoric and what the populists are saying. He wonders whether there are any lessons anywhere in any European country on toning down the language and the divisions, which have proved to be productive. Are there any healing processes anywhere? Can you think of a country?
Not really, no. I mean, to be honest, Portugal seemed to be Portugal has always seemed to me as a very kind of slow-moving, in a nice way, country. People always, this is very cliched, sounds like a typical, Expedia comment from a tourist. But, it seems a relatively peaceful kind of society. And and this is why I kind of hoped that they wouldn't have a far-right party, but one has come along. Certainly there are differences in sort of rhetorical traditions in different countries. I think in Britain there's been a really serious degeneration of political language over the last few years. It sounds like an old man pining after his youth, but I mean, honestly, the behavior of politicians I find shocking. And I think similar things have been happening in lots of other places, because the discrediting of the traditional elites, their inability to prevent and deal with the consequences of the financial crisis, their inability to really act on a series of problems that people think need addressing, which in part is a consequence of the way the world works. One single country, Italy, can't stop migration flows across the Mediterranean. Italy can't deal with the financial turbulence of a world in which money flies across the globe, in and out of tax havens, between one country and another. This is beyond the ability of any one nation state to deal with. So we're living in a world where national governments, unless you're the United States, basically, can't do much about a lot of the problems that we're facing. And this is very frustrating for people because we think we have democracy. We think we can vote for stuff, and the politicians will press a button, and it will happen. And I think part of the reason people are so angry is because politicians obviously don't set out to campaign and say, well, I'd love to do all this stuff, but we can't because the Americans won't let us, or because investors will leave, or because we can't stop the boats. Politicians are not wanting to say that because they want to claim that they can do stuff. But of course, when they get into office, they fail. I mean, the current government's promises on migration are obviously, they're trying to do something that's simply impossible, right? And they won't admit it. And they keep doubling down, doubling down. And by now, I think if you look at the polls, people don't believe them anymore because they made too many promises on migration and they have failed. But to be honest, they haven't failed because they because they decided to lie to the public. Well, maybe that as well. But they failed because what they thought would sell amongst voters was something that was not possible, right? And they weren't honest with people over the trade-offs. And that's kind of natural in a competitive political system. If you're too honest, you're going to lose. You could talk to Ed Miliband about that. He seemed to me an honest politician, and he was a miserable failure as a party leader. And I really liked him, which has taught me a lesson. Anyone I think seems like a good guy is going to fail.
You mentioned it very briefly. Julie, you're not a specialist, but she's wondering how will the impact of climate change affect the quality of life and well-being in Southern Europe? And may I just add, and are they asking themselves that question?
That's a really great question, and I really think the talk should have been about that, and I have to admit that I don't really know enough about it to speak with any authority, but I think it's the most important issue facing all of us, never mind Southern Europe. And Southern Europe is at risk of becoming a desert, frankly, over the coming decades. I mean, the way it turns out in Britain might be very different if the Gulf Stream ends. We're going to end up facing this kind of weather all the time, right? But that would be survivable. But for Southern Europe, especially where agriculture is a key part, not so much of the economy, although it is important economically, but it's particularly important culturally to people. If agriculture becomes no longer sustainable because of climate change, this is a big problem. But also, Padania, which I showed you in a map, northern Italy, the part that I spend most of my time in, is the most polluted region in Western Europe. It has horrific pollution, partly because of the fact that there's a lot of population and a lot of industry there, but it has a climate which effectively traps the pollution in this massive valley around the River Po. And you ask, are Italians aware of this? They don't seem to be, and I find it astonishing. You'd be amazed to think that I go to Bologna and I think, wow, the air quality is terrible here, and I live in London most of the time, right? I mean, partly because it's windier in Britain, so the pollution gets moved around more, but, it is shocking, and there's a shocking lack of awareness. There's also a shocking lack of acceptance of the reality of climate change. You still hear climate denialism to a much greater degree, I think, in the public sphere than you would hear. Again, that could be a product of an aging society. The fact is that, it is true that it's of less immediate importance to most of us here, right? Because the worst consequences are going to be visited on subsequent generations. And I think given that Southern Europe is such an aging part of the world, this problem becomes even more acute.
2 questions to finish, quite different ones. One from Marie. Thank you for the presentation. The turn towards the far-right ideologies is not the preserve of southern countries, she says. What about Poland and Hungary? They didn't experience the financial crash in the same way, and they still turned to far-right nationalism. So what does comparative politics tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm less of an expert on Eastern Europe, but I've taken an interest in Poland and Hungary precisely for the reason that they are the 2 EU countries which most decisively move towards a kind of right-wing authoritarian populist option. In the case of Hungary, actually, there's a very clear connection to the global financial crisis. Around the time just before 2008, a lot of Hungarians had the crazy idea that they should take out mortgages in Swiss francs. And they have their own currency, the florin, which obviously hasn't been keeping up with the Swiss franc. The Swiss franc has gone crazy ever since the financial crisis, because in a financial crisis, what happens is people panic and they put their money in the safest place they can think of, even if they're going to actually not make a profit out of it. And the safest places are Germany, Switzerland, those kind of locations. So the Swiss franc has gone through the roof, so a lot of people in Hungary were suddenly insolvent. And what Orban did is he basically forced the banks to write off the losses and imposed a ceiling on interest rates so that people could afford their mortgages. So I think Orban is a nasty piece of work, and I don't like his politics, but he did something for people in a moment of financial difficulty, and that is part of the reason he was given a reward. And you can tell a similar story about Poland, which was less affected by the crisis, but they've rolled out a series of sort of quite Christian democratic traditionalist forms of welfare support for a lot of the poorest regions of the country, lots of family credits and so on, which again have bolstered the incomes of people affected by economic difficulties. And if you add to that Poland's actually getting richer quite quickly, that's worked pretty well for them. But they did lose the last election, so obviously that does run out of road at some point.
I'm going to finish with a history question, a mixture of history and comparative politics, from Jeff Pettingill. He points out that Mussolini became prime minister in 1922, 102 years ago. So he wonders whether you see many parallels between the current political climate and that of around 100 years ago.
Yeah, so that's a really great question that I ask myself a lot. So when I go to Italy, I'm in the part of Italy that's relatively less sympathetic to the far right. So Bologna traditionally was the communist city. This is one of the things I love about Southern Europe, is that you can have a city which is the sort of haven of left-wing ideology, but it's incredibly rich and has very successful industries, very dynamic economy. And this kind of contradiction, it always shocked me when I first went to Southern Europe, that you could sort of have these two things put together. You could have, strong belief in Marxist ideology and have a very successful manufacturing industry, making everybody rich at the same time. And so Bologna isn't the best place to see it. What disturbs me is not so much that so many Italians really want a totalitarian state, because I think the interesting thing, which I could elaborate on, but there's no time and I haven't thought enough about it, but the far right is returning. But what would they do? They can't do totalitarianism. This is not a society where you can force people to put their kids out in uniforms and go to youth camps and chant, Il Duce and so on. That kind of stuff is not going to happen. So what is fascism going to look like now if they get the chance to put it into action? That I don't know. I think it's actually going to be a lot more normal and insidiously normal than you might imagine. But what really worries me is the inability of the anti-fascists to get themselves organized. I can kind of see, so what happens if Trump gets into power and starts suspending basic civil rights for a lot of Americans, which of course is already happening in some Republican states? Will people rise up and stop it, or will they sit at home on their social media complaining about it? And I think we can ask that same question for all of our societies that are facing. It's very troubling to see so many people prepared to vote for parties that represent the values that brought the world to total catastrophe halfway through the last century. How can we be making the same mistake again? Well, rather than wondering why people are falling for it, I think we need to get organized and say, no, it's not going to happen. If you try doing this, we're going to stop it, right? And it requires people to be engaged in politics. And how do you get people to engage in politics? Well, if only I knew. But, people need to take seriously that politics doesn't just happen because we stick a cross on a piece of paper every 5 years. You need to be on it all the time. Because if you're not on it, somebody else is on it. Somebody who doesn't have your interests at heart is on it. Like they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's the way democracy works. If we ignore it, other people are going to make it work for them and not for us.
Thank you, Jonathan, for such lucid answers to a lot of curveballs, and a really nice presentation, I thought, that gave everyone a comprehensive sense of these countries that we've been talking about, and that I think many of us love and admire in many ways. And perhaps we'll be feeling a little less pity for them as we go home, knowing that they actually have some of them are having quite nice lives. But I thought it was a wonderful, I actually felt, why did I wait so long to invite Jonathan back again? And I hope that he'll still be around, and I'll still be around for him to come back, and hopefully he'll tell us a better story about Southern Europe, because tonight has been so engrossing. I'm so grateful for his erudition tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.
Stand up.
Thank you.
Take a bow.